Family drama wasn't new to us. My parents had always been the type to keep things bottled up until they exploded, and my younger sister, Vanessa, seemed to think of confrontation as a competitive sport. But until recently, things had always managed to return to some sort of shaky balance. That all changed the summer after Dad's retirement. After 40 years working as an accountant, Dad finally retired, and he and Mom decided it was time to downsize and move into the smaller family home that had been sitting vacant for years in our old neighborhood. It was supposed to be a time of new beginnings, quiet mornings, no more 5 a.m. alarms, and enjoying their golden years. But the change turned out to be more than they had bargained for. Dad went from being busy and important, with clients relying on him, to spending his days organizing old tax records and tinkering with his car in the garage. Mom, who had always done everything around the house, was suddenly faced with Dad critiquing every little thing she did. Like she couldn't even load the dishwasher right without him having an opinion on it. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real trouble started when Vanessa decided to move back home. My sister had always been the wild one, never one for routine or settling down. After drifting between jobs in different states, she called one day saying she was ready to come back to town and figure things out. Mom and Dad, feeling a bit nostalgic for the days when the whole family was together, invited her to move into the spare room. And that's when the chaos really began. Vanessa wasn't just moving back home, she was bringing her opinions with her. She had this knack for walking into a room and dropping a comment like a grenade, leaving everyone else to deal with the fallout. And of course, Dad's newly retired self wasn't going to let anything slide. The first major blow-up happened over something as small as the living room furniture. It was a Tuesday evening, and Dad had decided it was time to rearrange the living room. He'd gotten it into his head that the couch would look better facing the window instead of the TV. He was in the middle of dragging the coffee table to the other side of the room when Vanessa strolled in, yawning in her oversized hoodie and leggings, her hair still wet from a shower. "What are you doing, Dad?" she asked, dropping onto the armchair that he'd just moved. "Trying to make this place feel a little more open," Dad grunted, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Thought we'd try something different." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Seriously? It's looked like this for 20 years. Why bother now? It's not like you have anything else to do." You could almost hear the snap in Dad's patience. He turned to face her, his face turning red, and said, "Well, excuse me for trying to improve things. Maybe if you actually helped around here instead of lounging around, you'd have a better understanding of what it takes to run a household." Mom, who had been folding laundry on the other side of the room, suddenly found a very interesting stain on a pillowcase that needed her full attention. Vanessa crossed her arms, looking amused in that infuriating way of hers. "Running a household? It's not that hard, Dad. Maybe you just don't know what to do with yourself now that you're not working." That stung, I could tell. Dad's face fell for a moment, but then he rallied. "I worked my whole life so that I could enjoy my retirement. Not that you'd know anything about working for something." And just like that, it was on. Vanessa shot back about how she was trying to figure out her life, how it wasn't fair for him to judge her after all the freedom she never got as a teenager, because he and Mom were always so strict. Dad countered with how she'd never stuck with anything for more than 6 months, always looking for the next exciting thing. The whole argument spiraled until Vanessa stormed upstairs, leaving Dad fuming and Mom awkwardly folding the same shirt over and over. That fight set the tone for the next few months. It was like Vanessa and Dad were locked in a constant battle for control of the house, with Mom caught in the crossfire. I tried to mediate when I visited, but it was like putting a Band-Aid on a broken dam. The arguments were endless, about the groceries, about Dad's new hobby of fixing up the old lawnmower, about the way Vanessa left her dishes in the sink. Each little thing became a flashpoint for a much deeper frustration that neither of them seemed able to address. Mom, for her part, tried to keep the peace, but even she was starting to crack under the strain. One Sunday, after yet another argument over dinner, this time about whether or not Vanessa should be helping with the bills, Mom finally snapped. She slammed the lasagna pan down on the counter, sending sauce splattering across the tiles. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice shaking. "I have had enough of this constant fighting. We are supposed to be a family, and all you two do is argue." The room went silent. Vanessa, who had been about to fire back at Dad for some comment he made, suddenly looked like a scolded child. Dad, too, seemed to shrink a bit, his shoulders slumping. And I just stood there, caught between the urge to laugh at how ridiculous it all was and the sudden realization that maybe this was more serious than I'd thought. Mom took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she picked up a dish towel. "I didn't ask for you to move back here to make everything harder," she said to Vanessa. "And I didn't ask for you to retire just so you could criticize every little thing I do," she added, turning to Dad. Dad tried to speak, but Mom held up a hand. "No, I'm talking now. You both are driving me crazy. And if we don't figure out how to live together, then maybe we shouldn't be living together at all." That hit hard. Vanessa's face turned pale, and Dad looked like someone had punched him in the gut. It was the first time I'd ever heard Mom suggest that maybe things wouldn't work out, that maybe this whole family under one roof thing was a mistake. We all sat down at the kitchen table that night, and for once, no one raised their voices. Vanessa apologized, her eyes downcast, saying that she never meant to make things so tense and that she was just struggling with being back home. Dad admitted that he felt like he had no purpose now that he wasn't working, and maybe he was taking that out on everyone else. And Mom, well, she just listened, her hands folded in front of her like she was holding herself together. It wasn't a magical fix. Things didn't suddenly become perfect after that talk. But something shifted. Dad started giving Vanessa more space, letting her make her own mistakes without jumping in with criticism. Vanessa tried pitching in more around the house, though she was still her usual self, leaving half-finished projects scattered around like breadcrumbs. And Mom, for the first time, started making time for herself, going to yoga classes in the mornings and visiting old friends. As for me, I kept visiting, but now I didn't feel like I had to be the referee. I could just be their daughter again, watching as they navigated this weird, messy phase of their lives. And slowly, they found a new balance, one that wasn't quite as fragile as the old one. Looking back, I think that summer changed us all. It was the first time we really had to confront each other as adults, with all the flaws and disappointments that came with it. And maybe that's just what families do, clash and fight until they figure out how to make it work, even when it feels like they're falling apart. The uneasy truce that followed our family meeting wasn't a perfect resolution. It was more like a bandage on a wound that still needed time to heal. The underlying tension lingered, surfacing at unexpected moments. Even though the yelling had stopped, you could sense the hurt feelings and unspoken words hanging in the air. But at least we were all trying. Dad was trying not to micromanage everything, Vanessa was trying to be more responsible, and Mom was trying to carve out a space for herself outside of the roles of mother and wife that she'd been stuck in for so long. In the weeks that followed, the house started to feel a little less like a battlefield and more like a home again, but it was still a delicate balance. Dad poured his energy into small projects around the house, fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, repainting the back porch, and for some reason, organizing the garage for the fourth time. He'd always been the kind of person who needed to feel useful, and since retiring, he'd been struggling to find a sense of purpose. Vanessa, for her part, made an effort to be more considerate. She started picking up after herself more, helping Mom with dinner, and even offering to do the grocery shopping, though she usually came back with half the items we actually needed and twice as many snacks. Still, she was trying, and that meant something. But I could see the restlessness in her, that feeling of being trapped in a place she thought she'd left behind. It was like she was always one bad day away from packing up and leaving again, even if she didn't know where she'd go. One Sunday morning, I decided to spend the day at the house and help Dad with one of his projects. He'd been talking about retiling the bathroom for weeks, and I figured it was a good excuse to spend some time together without having to dive into heavy conversations. Dad wasn't much of a talker, but he was always happy to explain how to do something with his hands, and I figured that might take his mind off things. As we worked side by side, scraping off the old cracked tiles, he started talking about his job, how much he missed the routine of it, the certainty. It was the most he'd opened up about retirement since it happened, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "You know, Emily," he said, prying loose a stubborn piece of grout, "when I was working, I always thought about how great it would be to finally have time for all the things I never got around to. But now, I don't know. I just feel like I'm in the way." I glanced over at him, seeing the tension in his shoulders. This was a man who'd spent his whole life taking pride in providing for his family, and now he didn't know what to do with himself. "You're not in the way, Dad," I said, even though I knew he wouldn't believe me. "It's just different for everyone, I guess. Finding a new routine." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. It struck me then how much he'd defined himself by his work, and how little space he'd made for anything else. Maybe that's why he and Mom had been struggling so much. They'd both built their lives around certain roles, and now those roles were changing, and they didn't know how to fit together anymore. Meanwhile, Vanessa was having her own crisis. One afternoon, I found her sitting out on the back porch, staring out at the overgrown garden that Dad kept saying he'd get to one of these days. She had that far-off look in her eyes, like she was somewhere else entirely, and it took her a moment to realize I was there. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, sitting down beside her. Vanessa glanced at me, then back at the garden, her mouth twisting into a rueful smile. "Yeah, just thinking, I guess," she said, pulling her hoodie tighter around herself, even though it was a warm day. "I keep thinking about all the places I wanted to go, you know? I had all these plans, and now I'm right back where I started." I didn't know what to say to that. Vanessa had always been the dreamer, the one who talked about moving to New York, then LA, then some beach town she read about in a magazine. She was always searching for something, though she never seemed to find it. And now here she was, back in our hometown, living with our parents again at 29. "You're not back where you started," I offered after a moment. "You've got more experience now. You've seen more of the world." Vanessa scoffed. "Yeah, I've seen a bunch of crappy apartments and part-time jobs. Great resume material." I reached out and put a hand on her arm. "You'll figure it out. You always do." She gave me a weak smile, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. It was like she was haunted by the fear that she'd never figure it out, that she'd always be drifting from one thing to the next, never finding a place where she truly belonged. But the biggest change was in Mom. After that night, when she'd broken down at the dinner table, something had shifted in her. She started taking long walks every morning, just by herself, and sometimes she'd come back with this peaceful look on her face, like she'd found a piece of herself that she'd forgotten about. She even started taking yoga classes at the community center, something that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. Mom had always been the rock, the one who kept everything running smoothly, and now she was learning how to let go a little bit. But the thing about family is that even when things seem to be getting better, old tensions have a way of resurfacing. One evening, about 2 months after the family meeting, we all sat down for dinner like we used to, me, Mom, Dad, and Vanessa. It was a quiet night, with the summer heat still clinging to the air. Mom had made roast chicken, and Dad had opened a bottle of wine. For once, things actually felt normal. We were halfway through dinner when Vanessa suddenly said, "I got a job offer." Everyone stopped eating. Dad put down his fork, and Mom's eyes widened with surprise. "That's wonderful, honey," she said, her voice a little too enthusiastic, like she was trying to hold back her relief. "Where is it?" Vanessa hesitated, and that's when I knew there was a catch. "It's in Seattle," she said, looking down at her plate. "It's just a barista job, but it's a start, and I think I need to go." Dad's face tightened. "Seattle? That's all the way across the country. You just got back, Vanessa." Mom reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away, looking at Vanessa with a mix of frustration and hurt. "You came back here because you said you wanted to figure things out with us. Now you're just going to run off again." Vanessa took a deep breath, her voice wavering. "I didn't come back because I wanted to stay forever, Dad. I came back because I needed a place to land, but I can't stay here forever. It's not what I need." Dad's expression hardened. "And what about what we need? What about your mother, who's been bending over backwards trying to keep this family together? You think it's easy for her?" Mom tried to intervene, but Vanessa's temper flared. "This isn't about you. It's about me. And I'm sorry if that's selfish, but I can't just sit around here and pretend that I'm happy." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, no one knew what to say. Vanessa pushed back her chair and stood up, leaving the table. "I'm going for a walk," she said, her voice tight, and before anyone could stop her, she was out the door, slamming it behind her. Dad sat there in stunned silence, staring at the spot where she'd been sitting. Mom reached out to him, her voice gentle. "She's just scared, Tom. She's trying to find her own way." But Dad shook his head, pushing his plate away. She's always running away, Janet. She never sticks around long enough to face anything. I watched them, feeling like an outsider in my own family. I wanted to say something to bridge the gap between them, to find some magic words that would make everything better. But I didn't have them. So I just sat there, watching as my parents dealt with the possibility of Vanessa leaving all over again. While outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Vanessa didn't come back until well after dark. Mom, Dad, and I had long finished dinner, and the silence in the house felt like something you could touch. Mom tried to keep busy, washing dishes that were already clean, straightening the cushions on the couch, but Dad just sat at the dining room table, staring out the window, his face drawn and tired. I thought about calling Vanessa, but I knew from experience that when she was upset, she needed space. So I decided to head home for the night, telling Mom I'd come back over in the morning to check in. I could feel the weight of her worry as I left. But what else could I do? That night, I lay in bed replaying the argument over and over. I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Vanessa's face, how it had gone from defiant to heartbroken in a matter of seconds. And Dad, too, with all his hurt feelings bundled up in his frustration. It was like they were speaking different languages, each trying to protect themselves but only hurting each other more. The next morning, I returned to find Vanessa already packing up her things. She was stuffing clothes into an oversized duffel bag in her room, her face set in that stubborn, determined way she had when she'd made up her mind about something. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Vanessa, are you really going to leave like this?" She paused but didn't look up. "Yeah, I need to get out of here, Emily. I can't just sit around and pretend that staying here is what's best for me." Her voice wavered a little, but she kept her head down, folding a faded concert t-shirt with more care than necessary. I sighed, stepping into the room. "I get it, okay? I really do. But can't you talk to them? At least try to make things right before you go." She finally stopped what she was doing and turned to face me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I don't know how to talk to Dad anymore. It's like every time I open my mouth, I'm just disappointing him again." I put a hand on her shoulder, trying to be the steady one for once. "I don't think he's disappointed in you. I think he's scared of losing you. And you're scared, too, of getting stuck here. But leaving like this won't make it any better." She bit her lip, glancing out the window towards where Dad was sitting on the porch, pretending to read a newspaper. "I don't want to hurt him, Em, but I don't know if I can stay here and be what they want me to be." I nodded, understanding all too well the pressure of family expectations. You don't have to be what they want, but maybe just let them know that. It's not about staying or going. It's about not burning bridges when you leave. Vanessa didn't answer right away, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. After a long silence, she finally said, "Okay, I'll try to talk to him, but no promises." I took that as a win. Later that afternoon, when Dad went back inside for lunch, Vanessa followed him into the kitchen. I watched from the living room, not wanting to interfere, but listening in just enough to make sure things didn't go off the rails. "Dad," she started, her voice uncertain. "Can we talk for a minute?" He looked up, clearly surprised that she was speaking to him first. He set his plate down on the counter, crossing his arms. "Yeah, we can talk," he said, but there was a wary edge to his voice. Vanessa took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for the way I've been acting. I know it hasn't been easy having me back here, and I appreciate everything you and Mom have done for me. But I need to go to Seattle. It's not because I don't want to be here with you guys. It's because I need to figure out who I am without feeling like I'm stuck." Dad's expression softened a little, but there was still a deep sadness in his eyes. "You think we're trying to hold you back?" "No, I think you're trying to help," Vanessa said, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "But sometimes it feels like you think I'm still a kid, like I can't make my own decisions without messing them up." Dad sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I just don't want you to make the same mistakes I made when I was younger. I wanted you to have more stability, more security, and it's hard to see you struggling." Vanessa looked down at her hands, her voice small. "Maybe I need to make my own mistakes. Even if they're stupid." There was a long pause, and I could feel the tension in the air between them. Then Dad nodded slowly. "Maybe you do, and maybe I've been too hard on you. I don't want you to think that leaving means you can't come back." Vanessa's eyes welled up again, but she blinked back the tears. I know, Dad. I'll always be your daughter. I just need to do this. Okay. They stood there for a moment, not quite hugging, but not arguing either, and I saw something shift between them, an understanding that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. After that conversation, things felt different. Vanessa still planned to leave, but now there was less of a rush in her movements, like she didn't feel the need to run away as quickly as possible. She spent more time with Mom, helping out in the kitchen and going on walks together, and even joined Dad for a few of his home improvement projects. It was like she was trying to make up for the time she'd lost being angry and defensive, and for once, Dad seemed willing to let her. On her last night in town, we all sat out on the back porch together, just like we used to when we were kids. The air was cool, and the sky was filled with stars. Mom brought out a pitcher of lemonade, and we all just sat there, sipping our drinks and listening to the crickets. For a little while, it felt like the old days, like we were a family that could find peace in each other's company. Vanessa left early the next morning. Dad didn't say much as she loaded up her car, but he gave her a long hug before she got in, whispering something to her that I couldn't hear. Mom cried a little, but they were the kind of tears that held both sadness and relief, like she knew this was the right step for all of us. As Vanessa pulled out of the driveway, she rolled down the window and gave us a wave. I could see the anxiety in her eyes, but there was also a glimmer of hope, like maybe this time she really would find what she was looking for. After she was gone, the house felt emptier, but lighter too. The arguments had left scars, but there was also a sense of healing in the silence. Dad went back to his projects, but he seemed less tense, more at ease. Mom continued with her walks and her yoga classes, and sometimes she'd even join me for a coffee in town, something she'd never made time for before. And me? I realized that my place in all this had changed too. I wasn't just the mediator or the peacemaker anymore. I was part of the family in a new way, someone who could be there for my parents without feeling like I had to fix everything. It's been a few months now since Vanessa left. She calls me every couple of weeks, telling me about her new apartment, her job at the coffee shop, and a new friend she's making. She sounds happier in a way I haven't heard in a long time. And I can hear the pride in Dad's voice when he talks about her, even if he won't admit it out loud. We're all still figuring things out. How to be a family without living under the same roof. How to support each other without smothering each other. But maybe that's just what life is. A constant adjustment. A dance between holding on and letting go. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like we might actually be getting it right.